Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. You know, a lot of times I record at night because it's only the only time I have to record. Maybe it's going to rain the next day or whatever. Hopefully it doesn't rain on us tonight. Tonight I feel utterly compelled to record for a very interesting reason. This documentary came out on Mr. Rogers. For those of you who don't live in America, I'm sure you still know who he is, but he was a gentleman out of it's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He created a show for kids at a time when society was struggling to understand human development, had never really stopped to figure it out, at least in the modern age, quote unquote. There was a lot of study going on in the 1950s about child development. And this guy, Fred Rogers, he figured out what no one else had figured out, which is that television was doing its thing, and it wasn't necessarily doing a good job talking to children because of all the research being so cutting edge in the 50s at least. The research wasn't being boiled down for parents and being taught to kids so that when they become parents, they become great parents and they raise great kids. So I watched this show as a kid. I watched Captain Kangaroo first and then eventually Mr. Rogers. And having watched this documentary, which I want to say to you guys, moved me as deeply as I can be moved. Because what are we trying to do on this show? I say we, for all the reasons I've noted in previous episodes. But if you're sort of a fan of this show, then there's probably two tracks that you're following, minus maybe some obsessive moon thing. I hope you'll keep listening. I hope you clicked anyway. My theme of the show is always rebuilding society from the ground up. Right. In a way, that was Mr. Rogers' OG principle way back in the day, in the late 60s. I believe 1967 was his first show. Now, if you're a truther, you're tired of being lied to, and you're simply looking for methodologies to develop a protocol for life. You're trying to correct all of the things that have been presented to you as truth that have essentially done you harm. What happens when you get told an untruth? Well, it fills up space in your mind and it misguides you. Mr. Rogers' MO was essentially to do a couple different things. To the kids, he gave them the most powerful message, which is that you're special. Aside from the fact that you may or may not do anything extraordinary or have done anything extraordinary yet in your life. You are extraordinary and special because you exist. And he was a very religious man. So his message came from the divine creator to you. You wouldn't exist if you weren't special. Why create you if you weren't special? To the adults, he was trying to help them understand, look, within the world of a child, it is probably more intense than the world of an adult. Because as an adult, you have a fair amount of things that you have learned through experience that will give you context for what is happening. Things that are scary, especially. You know how to deal with unknowns. You have a protocol to deal with them. But when you're a child, you feel like you're supposed to know things. And when you don't know things, well, it's scary, isn't it? What's underneath your bed? What's in that closet? What was that sound? Why is an adult angry? Why is an adult potentially harming you? When I look at this documentary, you have a gentleman that worked for, I guess you could say, a little over 30 years to try and gift society with a methodology, both for the young and for the old. Sadly, I think the only messages that really came across were to the kids, who are luckily us now. He held an optimism and an ideal belief that we are good people until we are taught otherwise. And I think every single one of us knows that that's true. It's been nearly 2 decades since this man passed. And we know that the world has become ever vicious, ever evil, with individuals, I would say this, with things like the QAnon movement, the cult of wake up and think for yourself, with a cult that says this is evil and this is good. A cult that says look inside yourself and simply acknowledge what you already know is good. Because we have this little silly this silly notion that doing no harm to others is a great idea. Fred Rogers, being a religious gentleman, said, his philosophy, as noted by his family and friends, was to love your neighbor and love yourself. Now, that's a great idea, but we know that people are being indoctrinated into the divide as they have missed the message about themselves that he tried to transmit to kids on his show. They are lost and they are disingenuous. They're the forgotten kids of the world. They have gone through this meat grinder that is the world. And they're still young. They have the majority of their years left when they suddenly realize, wow, this ain't working out. I did what I was told, and it didn't work out. Now I want my government to pay for everything. In fact, I just want things that I see other people have because it hurts so much inside that they have it and I don't. As I watch the documentary, I see this incredible, incredible human who could have easily just looked out into the world and said, geez, this place is so dark and so evil, and there's so many people against his agenda. He could have given up at any point in time and said, well, the voice of one is potentially not enough to make an impact on people, even though he had the audience of most likely tens of millions of people. I'm willing to bet before he passed away, he probably was viewed by damn near 1 billion people, if not more, individual souls over the years. But definitely a few 100 million. I don't know the numbers. 1967. He took some time off at one point. Then he relaunched his show. He felt this incredible burden to bring light to the world, to give as many real-world examples to kids that parents were terrified to discuss with kids. I was shocked to find out that even before I was born, when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, he covered an episode where he, playing his little Freddy puppet, the little tiger dude, he asked the question, what is assassination? I mean, the guts in this guy and the wisdom of this guy. I would probably tell anyone I know, if you were my closest best friend in the entire world, I would tell you, we need to resurrect this guy in our own soul and take the tack that, yeah, we need to rediscover the genius of this man. And like he said, there are a lot more of him in this world than we actually are willing to acknowledge. And I obviously think that's true. It's why I've said it several times on my show. That's not a profound statement by me by any stretch, but it's a good reminder every once in a while for us to hear it. I debate what to call this show. Part of me just wants to call it Mr. Rogers. I think that'll gain a few more eyeballs. Be kind of funny. This dude's going to cover Mr. Rogers? Isn't he the moon hoax dude? Isn't he the guy that swears a lot in his episodes? Yeah, sorry. In honor of him, we won't swear in this episode. For those of you who've been in the truth movement for any number of years, or for those of you who are like a top fuel drag race car and you've only just awakened, you would be able to attest in a court of law with a lie detector test attached to your every extremity, that it's a very, very tough path at times. The first struggle is your own awakening. It's a birthing process. It is so much like Neo coming out of the Matrix. It's uncomfortable physically. It's tormenting mentally. The more that you become informed about things, or at least informed about the things that perhaps are wrong, and you don't have the answers yet, because you haven't been out enough, or the information where you're waking up is very sparse. It's a very isolating event. And what I think is absolutely interesting and fascinating and ironic when you watch this documentary on Mr. Rogers, I saw it through Amazon Prime on HBO. I suggest you get a copy of this, watch this. I don't know where it is. Get it and watch it. It's an extremely isolating evolution in mankind, because the sad fact is that the majority of the population in the world is asleep. And I think that certain cynical people who come into this movement as merely an observer and not a participant might believe that we say those things to somehow pat ourselves on the back, to put ourselves up on a pedestal of intellectual enlightenment so that we may feel superior to others. If you watch the Mr. Rogers documentary and you get all the way to the end, there's a couple closing shots of his face, as he especially does a public service announcement about the events of 9/11, which is sadly one of the last things that he got to observe in this world. I don't think the face that you see on him at the end of the tour of his life is anything remotely associated with feeling superior. It is a face of, oh my God, I just spent 30 plus years of my life succeeding in a region of human development that was extremely important, to only see it unraveled by acts of terror on that same society. So this man potentially ended his life not knowing whether or not what he gifted society with would remain. Now imagine that, as an example, I'm sitting in my backyard, and for some freak of nature, this particular show were to get some broadband distribution. I had the same juice that guy had in the way that I do it, right? Not to children, but to adults. His game was children. He understood kids on a level that was angelic, amazing. And that documentary should jerk your heartstrings several times if you understand even the most remote sense of the insecurities that a child can have. Feeling insignificant. Potentially having parents that never say those little words, I love you. And here comes this guy that looks into your soul as a child, and he smiles a smile that child desperately needed. And in an instant, all of the damage of perception that child may have manifested in being in an isolated world is mended. He gave them the tool chest to leave his presence and remain intact. And as they ran into issues, they used his tool chest to fix themselves. Now, often I will do a show about a controversial area of our human development where in the end of the show, I have to admit to you, I'm not sure how to fix it. And the thing I always gravitate to, which is sort of a low-hanging fruit methodology, is to say education. Obviously, it's true. It's sort of a cliche nowadays in the truth movement, but it's obviously a cliche that goes back as far as man has understood the concept of education, of passing knowledge through some form of communication. But let's just say this show gets his circulation. There's still more dark forces out there than us who exist, which is you and me, to be able to correct for all things that are out there, pushing against us, trying to create human suffering and human divide. When I look at that documentary, which beautifully documents between the forces that were dominating the airwaves, which is 99.9999% of everything on television, and then a show like his, which again is not really meant for adults, although I didn't really realize how multi-layered his intent was. He was just a drop in the bucket, an eye drop in an ocean filled with consumerism, with every level of indoctrination that tears apart societies, worshiping war, sex, anything to appeal to your sort of low-hanging fruit in life, right? Well, you can get this really easily. I think Prince in his Love Sexy album has a song called Positivity, and one of his final choruses in the song is, "It's more hard to love than it is to hate." I never wanted to believe that was true, and I made an episode on it, Positivity, way back in season 1. It's barely watched, go figure. But I think it's sadly true. We are now at a point when the truth movement, its main archetypal theme is that we start to realize that the struggles that we have endured our entire life, depending on how old you are, but I guess if you're born in the last 100 years, you're probably in this camp, is that a lot of the suffering and the pain that you've gone through that you wouldn't be proud of, right? There's some pain and suffering that's very formative and important, and it builds up resistance. But a lot of it was unnecessary. It was orchestrated, designed, and unleashed on mankind. In this episode, I'm hoping the following. Mr. Rogers stopped his show after doing numerous episodes in order to make a show for adults. And I saw a few clips that they put in this documentary. I had never seen the show in my life. But he found that it was very difficult to identify with adults because the biases are already installed. We have simply turned becoming an adult into shutting off our minds, shutting off our souls, sanctioning our love, sanctioning our complete spectrum of humanity. When you're born as a child, something of which he remained absolutely intact in his own psyche, regardless of what age he was, he knew how to kneel down to a child, look them eye to eye, and connect with them on a level that was instantaneous and absolute. And the evidence is in hundreds of video interactions that he had with children. And regardless if the child had a disability or was completely intact physically and mentally, it was the even playing ground for that guy. He connected absolute for all kids. On this show, it's obviously a very adult-themed show. For me, life goes something like this. I believe that we are utterly and completely gifted with all the answers to all the questions that we might possibly be able to conceive. All of the solutions for the needs and the wants that we have are accessible. And to the degree we keep an open mind and then exercise that mind and open it and thus gain more vision/enlightenment, then we have a lot more tools at our disposal. So the master of humanity on an adolescent level found it nearly, well, I wouldn't say impossible, but definitely more difficult, quantifiably more difficult, to connect with adults. So I'm hoping that perhaps this venue of this particular show might be able to get a little deeper than he was able to get because I built my platform on communicating with adults, right? I thought about calling this episode, what we're doing here. And I don't necessarily mean in the universe and reality, but what we're doing on this show. One doesn't have to look any further than our Facebook page to realize there are a bunch of amazing people with amazing souls that are just like Mr. Rogers' soul. And we are desperately trying to figure out the thing to say, the way to behave, to take something that's important yet complicated and boil it down and refine the words so that when we say it to another human being, regardless of what state of perhaps denial they're in, hostility that they're in, any stage of the Kubler-Ross effect, they're able to hear us in a very deep and meaningful way such that they can start their own journey. Sort of that spark that goes into Frankenstein to give him life. We don't have the key to get out of the matrix if it is one. And so we are stuck being the hacker Neo within the matrix to pass around memes and videos and funny, interesting, inquisitive posts so that perhaps we can jog the soul of another human being to say, look, it might not be the way you think it is. Or the complete inverse, which is sort of Mr. Rogers' take, which is to say, it's just like it was when you were a kid. You've just been convinced by indoctrination or the chatter and the chaos around your life that you are subjugated, you are a slave to evil. That it gets to choose first. You get to choose second. It'd be like if you were an indentured servant somewhere and a bunch of food is made every day, but your evil overlords get to pick all the good food first, and they get to fill their belly way beyond their need, and you get the scraps on the floor, and they throw down a little bone with some meat on it. It's the theme of the Pixar movie Bug's Life. It is the theme of, the last part of Three Amigos, that comedy with Martin Short, Chevy Chase, and Steve Martin. The poor Mexican village that gets overrun by El Guapo and all of his men, and they go and they take everything that's great, including the people, the women, and you get what's left. I don't know about you, but I'm tired of that game. But at the same time, I don't think that if we gave Mr. Rogers every resource he ever wanted, would he have ever gone in a violent way? Any type of draconian manner? Any Orwellian manner? There are a lot of ways to educate people, and we now, due to social media, have been able to engage in infinitely more methods than we ever have before. Written word, video, meme. We still talk to each other as human beings, hopefully. In a silly way, although I think this isn't silly at all, we owe it to people like Fred Rogers to not forget what he was trying to do. He took it 35 years, and he had to lay it down because he got sick. But he gave it his all during those 35 years. He is one of many who have done such a thing. And we owe it to him, and I think ourselves, and if you believe in a God, for the Almighty, to pick up that torch and keep going. To add our special access to human beings to the formula. Some of you will be amazing with children. You have access to children. If I was running, I should say this, I have a former associate of mine whose husband ran a daycare center, or he does to this day. And if I were that guy, if I had seen this documentary and I had not already fluently understood what Mr. Rogers was trying to do, it would change the rest of my interaction as an overseer of kids to be as much like that guy as you could possibly be. I mean, the dude wrote the playbook on how to interact with kids and give them self-esteem. Now, they ended the documentary with it sounded like the Fox Morning crew, and I was extremely disappointed to hear this. I've always told you those guys are no better than anyone else in fake news, but they completely misinterpreted his message and his intent, and they were essentially trying to blame all of the millennials on Mr. Rogers because he simply said, "You're special. Right now, you're special," without accomplishing anything extraordinary. This is something he clarified, speaking to the last college that he spoke to. They said that he developed entitlement in kids because he told them that they were special, that they didn't have to do anything to be special, that they were simply special. Now, that's not what the dude was saying. You'll hear me echo the other theme in many of my episodes, but not with such a cynical tone. It's fun to become something that you want to become, whatever that is, right? But I don't want to digress into the specifics of how to do something and all that in this episode. What I want to reinforce for an hour is the theme of this dude's life, because I think it is at the very core of what we're trying to do and what we now affectionately call the Great Awakening. But even without a Great Awakening, we need to be doing this every single day to each other and to ourselves so that we can get out of this rat race of reporting to evil overlords, to allow them to rent space in our mind and write the protocols, the bylaws, and the matrix code inside of our brains to adopt and adhere to their evil ways. When 9/11 happened, I had this really sad epiphany at some point. I don't know what year it was, probably 5 to 10 years afterwards. Of all the people, I still have this feeling. Of all the people that just crossed the 9/11 line in their life, having lived a full, wonderful life, bringing enjoyment and self-esteem to others, happiness to others in any way, shape, or form, and they cross that line, they see this event occur, and due to health reasons, age, what have you, they passed away on the other side. What must they have thought on their deathbed about where the world was going? We have a moment in time that I have always said is going to be a very short window before the evil figures out how to close that window. And they will not only close that window, but they will close it by removing it, paving over it, and then erasing the notion in all men's minds that windows exist. And they will take control of your children, and they will indoctrinate them away from any belief that freedom even exists. They will redefine freedom as the lowest possible form of existence on this earth. But now the world's a complex place, isn't it? Oh, let's just say that America, and I do apologize to anyone listening outside the country. I don't mean to make this a pro-American thing only here. But it's good to think about this just as a 350 million person movement, just for 1 second. You can substitute your own country. But wherever you live, your country figures it completely out. You become completely enlightened. The themes of Mr. Rogers are taught to your children, and everyone ends up very balanced. There are no evil overlords in your government, in your banking, in your consumerism. Holidays reduced to this moment where people actually enjoy being with each other as the primary gift. As Stevie Wonder said in his song, I Wish We Were Just Happy for the Joy the Day Would Bring. Because sometimes we wouldn't get any gifts at all. I often will mention the little statement of skin in the game. It was the maiden voyage of MK Ultra Radio where my co-host Kyle said, we have essentially come to the point in our lives where we feel like we got to have some skin in the game. And we started that show when everything was horrid. We had a bad president, a bad administration, the military, anyone who was good for decent, peaceful interpretations of human existence on this planet were forcibly retired, while those that served the evil overlords were given their positions. We're no longer in that hopeless world. We're in a good state, a good opportunity. Not only are we able to figure out what to say, but now there's an infinitely greater group of people who are listening. So that's why we have to figure out what we want to say, what's important. I have made over 350 episodes. If you really count it, it's 375. You go for all this special reports. There's a few that are turned off. Special reports that is. But I'm still going. There's still more to say. There's still more parts of society we have to dissect and analyze. I talk for an hour and a half, 2 hours. And for you diehard listeners, I'm just scratching the surface half the time. Just reading you the syllabus of the semester-long course at a gigantic college of life. But what I find brilliant about Mr. Rogers is that he boiled it down to some pretty basic things. Now, I do want to make a distinction because I haven't made this distinction in the past. I could probably make an entire episode on this subject matter, but there's this debate in the upper intellectuals of at least the circles that I travel in as to whether or not one is to feel what is right first and then act, versus to act and worry about your feelings later. I don't know about you, but in my life, when I have taken action without analyzing my feelings first, getting a sense of perspective of my actions actually being either appropriate or inappropriate, I have failed almost categorically in that behavior. And when I take some time off from maybe a moment of great frustration and think it through, and sometimes it's a lot longer than you want to analyze it. You feel like you need to take action because time is of the essence. When you think it through, you typically make the best judgment you can possibly make. And again, sometimes we just have things that happen and we simply have to make that choice really quickly. At that point, the best thing I can do is to disengage my direct consciousness, feel the universe, give me a frequency of either truth or caution, I should say. And I just let something natural happen, and sometimes that works as well. Now, what's interesting for this guy is that he was able to anthropomorphize his personality into puppets that he used on his show. Now, for me personally, the puppet side of the game sort of freaked me out a little bit because it was just a little strange. I don't know why. I think that I remember the appearance of the puppets kind of freaked me out a little bit as a kid. Thought that was interesting. But now after I watched the documentary and realized that these things had different personalities that all contradicted each other to highlight the discussion, I now think that he was more brilliant on his first show than most people are on their last show who try to do these kind of things. Bruce Lee used to say this thing about being like water in his fighting style, because water was fluid. Water took the shape of anything that it was poured into. And so he said in his fighting style, you must be dynamic enough to be like water. I think that's brilliant. There's a part of that I think applies to the way we approach ourselves and life, to be dynamic, to be able to roll with the punches of the chaos of life. But I think it all comes back to a core. And again, sometimes those things are so cerebral, they're hard to understand. But watching this documentary made me feel like, oh my God, this dude just boiled it all down. But it's one thing to say, love your neighbor and love yourself. He didn't say love your neighbor as you love yourself, which is something that is said in biblical references, which I don't think works, because I might be a lot tougher on myself than I would ever be appreciated for by my neighbor. But his method of saying it is to say, love your neighbor, and that probably means you need to adjust yourself as the neighbor needs to be loved. He had a couple kids come in. One kid was in a wheelchair. Another kid, I'm not sure what, maybe suffering from MS or something, had a helmet on. Both kids fully sentient. Brilliant little kids. And you saw him change just a little bit to accommodate them. The message he put forth to them was unique. Custom fit for them. I think that's brilliant. I dated a girl once who had she still does, a beautiful daughter who was Down syndrome. I had never dealt with that before. She was probably about 13 when I met her. And there was she was starting to really gain control. She was getting to be a larger kid, like a normal sized kid. And she struggled with moments of frustration. And she would act out in physical ways, never in front of me. And I went over there once, the very first time, where we had decided our relationship had hit a sweet spot where I could meet the kids. She had 2 other kids. And I remember that we carefully orchestrated the moment when I met the other daughter, the first daughter, the oldest daughter, who had Down syndrome. And she couldn't talk much. She had a few words. And I remember the only thing I put in my head, because I thought this little girl could read my soul, was I just beamed utter and complete love at her. And she had this beautiful, beautiful eyes and a beautiful smile. And I just sat with her, and we had a great time. And then we got her to bed later that evening, and her mother came up to me and said, she has never responded to anyone like that before. And that was probably the closest thing I've ever done to a Mr. Rogers moment in my life. But what did I do? I didn't overthink it. I just let it happen, and I went back to my core that I was raised with, which is to be as honest and as pure as I could possibly be with another human being. And I felt like in her presence, in my mind, she may not have all the things that other kids have, but the one thing I credited her with, and I think quite accurately, and was probably a divine moment where I was inspired myself, was to acknowledge the fact that she could see deeper into my soul than anyone else I had met to that point. And I thought it was probably instantaneous. And I didn't premeditate the moment. I didn't really I can almost assure you, now thinking back, I didn't really drive up to the house going, oh my God, it's that moment I'm going to meet her daughter, and I hope this goes well, and I better behave like this and do that. I just let it be. And when she had to be put into an assisted living home, I went with her, and I sat down with her, and we watched Barney together. And that's when I heard her sing, and she knew the words. She was mesmerized by something very pure, very innocent, and custom made for her. I bring that up because I really do, well, let's put it this way. I'll give you another analogy, a scientific analogy that I think applies to our human nature. We keep overcomplicating the universe because to us it is chaotic and it's hard to understand at times. But I think that the most beautiful, elegant, true solutions to life is pure simplicity. I was having a good conversation with a friend of mine regarding organized religion. And it reinforced in me like crazy this previous experience I had had, which I'm going to share here. I think in the theme, Mr. Rogers being religious, this is appropriate. Now, what I'm about to say is most definitely not the closing beliefs of Fred Rogers. I had these Mormon kids come into my house, like I've said in several previous episodes. And it was probably about a year after I had finally just come to peace with the notion that I don't believe that Christ ever existed. Again, I'm not slamming the message by any stretch. I just don't think the person ever existed. But these kids came in and they said, we're from the Latter-day Saints. And I said, that's great. Let's sit down and talk. I don't know anything about your world. I've heard it criticized a million times, but I really don't know what you kids believe. Tell me. And the conversation proceeded, and I wanted to be fully open with them because I didn't want to lead them down a false path. I said, well, I have to be very honest with you, and I have come to the conclusion that I don't think Christ ever existed. And of course, let's put it this way. Other than perhaps knocking on the door of an atheist that would be very blunt about such a belief, they had never met someone who believed in the message, or many messages I should say, of the Bible, but still didn't believe that Christ existed. It was a new thing for them. And so they asked me to pray to God for, I guess, an alteration of my belief, to reinforce the idea that this Son of His existed and came down to earth in the flesh and died for our sins. And I prayed, hesitantly, because I talk to God all the time, several times a day, out loud with my voice. And I asked Him, okay, I'm going to hold up my word with these kids, and I'm going to ask you about this. And it took about 3 weeks. And I woke up in my bed one morning, and the room was beautifully lit. And it wasn't as if I was in my bed under sheets. It was as if I was in the palm of God, and my bed was His hand. And He, I know it sounds a little nuts, but I'm just telling you, you know me. Pretty straight shooter, right? It's very hard to put into words because this whole thing was an emotional epiphany. But His first communication with me was something to the effect of, I'm here. I'm here for your answer. Let me know when you're ready. And I remember almost feeling like I was turning around from being on my side to being sort of on my hands on His palm. And I said, I'm ready. And He said, you have never, ever, nor will you ever be out of my presence. And presence felt like the word bosom. You're always near and dear to me. Right here, right on my heart. You're always with me. And if you were ever outside of my presence, you simply wouldn't exist. So that is the very proof that you're within my presence. We are never apart. We never have been apart. There's nothing you can do to be apart from me. You're here. Boom. Done. So at face value, the whole thing was, well, yeah, this overcomplicated protocol we have with God in the form of any organized religion, the do's and don'ts and what you got to do to get to heaven and all this other hoopla, was immediately moot, and it felt, for the very first time in my entire life, godlike, simple, beautiful. So, of course, these Mormon kids want me to address the other half of the question, because I really didn't ask the other question. I've always believed that one. But to hear it from the GOD and some beautiful feeling in my heart, it changed me forever. So I said, well, they want me to ask you about this person, Jesus, being your son. And then I felt sort of like this disappointment that I had to ask the question in the first place. I had just been given the answer. And had I just closed off the channel with God, I probably would have determined this other answer by myself. But I was asking sort of as man would say it to man, a dumb question. And there was a pause. There literally was a beat in the script where it's almost as if God gave me the chance to rescind the question and take it on myself to think. I was being lazy. I wasn't thinking. But he obliged anyway. And that's when I looked down into my mattress, because he asked me this question first before I looked down. He said, who would want you to believe that I would kill my only son to create this relationship, this business transaction of baptism to get to me, and this whole idea that you're away from me in the first place? Who would ever want you to believe such a thing? And I misinterpreted the answer, which is why I'm going to clarify it here, because it's so appropriate to the theme of this show, in my opinion. I looked down, and in my mind's eye, I saw the Garden of Eden, something that I do not believe exists, but he was answering it in symbol. And immediately I saw the serpent in the tree. And immediately the answer came to me. Who would want you to believe such a horrific story? That first there's original sin to begin with, and that I got to kill my only son to bring us together? The devil. Satan himself. And I had never thought that. And what ended up being the case was he said, this whole book that people lean on, in Christianity especially, and anyone who believes in original sin, they've been reading the doctrine of the devil. Now, let me clarify what I actually ended up understanding about the answer, because I'm not trying to say that the wisdom within the Bible is evil. How do they dupe you in the truth movement? Well, they might tell you 80, 90% the truth. And that last 10 to 5%, it's a doozy, right? I know I changed my percentages there, but let's just go with it. They misguide you at the last second into their control apparatus. Everyone's worried that QAnon will do a flip at the end. I think that's bunk, because I think that to teach everyone how to think for themselves and truly identify evil for what it is, and then to somehow try to turn them at the last second, I don't think that works. And that's the last theme you would teach man before a big dupe job. All you would simply do is say, these people are bad, these people are good, we're the good, they're the bad, and then you dupe. But you don't teach them how to think for themselves. You provide all the answers. That's not what's going on in the Great Awakening, is it? You're encouraged to think for yourself. Isn't that the theme of the Great Awakening? For a second, I thought God was saying that there is a devil. I no longer think that's what he was saying. I think what he was saying is evil in general. The evil overlords who are quite human on this planet. Those that invented the notion of original sin. Those who took the most beautiful parables man has ever been inspired by God to write down and put them inside of a story to create a control apparatus around man, to derive money and control. I won't mention anything specific in this episode, but we know what I mention most of the time when I mention these evil organizations that call themselves churches. They do bad things to our kids. But because of the control apparatus, they're untouchable, right? What happened at the end of Star Wars 1, or Star Wars 4, I should say, A New Hope? The unthinkable. Obi-Wan Kenobi sacrifices himself to Darth Vader. And what is his final parting words as a human being who is alive? If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you could possibly imagine. I know another dude that went to the other side. His name is Fred Rogers. Now imagine, through all the experiences you've ever heard of or had yourself, with potentially the spirit realm being completely capable of influencing those who are willing to listen based on the themes of what you're willing to listen to. So if you are worshiping Satan, you're going to listen to dark messages. If you're worshiping God, you're willing to listen to light messages, bright messages, good messages. This dude saw 9/11, and shortly after that had to leave due to health reasons. He is one voice and one person that we know by name because he had the ability to get on television for a lot of us as kids. But we know there's probably infinitely more people with the same exact agenda, perhaps those who even converted after passing, that are willing to give us that guidance if we're just willing to listen. And beautifully, a lot of us are alive, right? We talk to each other. We want the deception to stop. We want truth to fill the gaps that are the voids laid down by lies. Now, it's tough to listen and think that you've got truth when no one's there to stamp it and say, oh yeah, this one is totally true. And so what we have to do is develop very specific doctrine to say, this is what is good and this is what is bad. This is light and this is dark. The visual metaphor of recording at night is actually fairly powerful, isn't it? I am surrounded by dark, but I am lit by a light. I've always thought that when I taught kids anything, it was the greatest responsibility I've ever had in my life, especially when I had one of my own. But I talked to plenty of young kids prior to having my own kid. When you teach kids, young people, it's very important you don't misguide them. You don't say anything that could be misconstrued later on as some sort of pass or fail test in life, by which if they view themselves as failing, your suggestion that they think that they're a failure afterwards. Well, kids, you got to do this to succeed. And then they go, oh my God, I'm not doing it. I'm a failure. I guess I'll never be one of those successful people. Boom. And they ding themselves down. I think there are a lot of little kids inside grown-up bodies all over the world. And I think we all have that vulnerable part of ourselves that basically struggles on a daily basis to try to make sense out of everything. But we're supposed to be grown up, right? We're supposed to be knowledgeable and wise after a certain number of years pass. But the more that we rely on help, we don't go and hunt our food anymore. We don't craft anything anymore. It's all a purchase service. The more we get indoctrinated that if we don't have certain items in life, we're not successful. It's very, very difficult to hang on to those base principles because we get clouded with our sort of man-made desires, don't we? Let me give you a little litmus test that'll help you kind of decipher what I just said, even though I think it was pretty clear and most of you got it. If you were to take a piece of paper and write down everything that makes people happy today, in 2019, and then take that piece of paper and go back 200 years and say, strike everything off this list that is not on the list of someone 200 years ago. They can't have it because televisions don't exist, and internet doesn't exist, and whatever doesn't exist. I think when you strike it all down, if you put not only the emotional things that make us happy, but the material objects that make us happy, guess what's going to be left on that piece of paper? All the things that are free, that come with humanity, that come with being alive, love, giving, forgiveness, empathy, sympathy, That's Mr. Rogers. He wasn't going around to schools handing out, Oprah prizes under their seats. What did that guy do? He sat down, he smiled, and he gave every one of these kids his individual attention. They wanted to come up to him and tell him things. I like you, Mr. Rogers. And he'd say, I like you too. You're special. Just the way you are, right? Easy. Easy. And how much money did he have to give out of his pocket every time one of these life-changing events happened for people? Zero. Nothing. How many times you ever been in a relationship and the person that you're with can't be happy unless you're out spending money somewhere? I mean, it's an imperative. You can't eat at home. You got to go out in a fancy place. You couldn't possibly spend the weekend inside. You got to always be at a concert, be at some gathering, some museum, amusement park. You got to be doing something to make yourself feel special. And then you're sitting there saying, no, wait a minute. It's not like I don't want to eat out every once in a while or go someplace special, do something special. But what the hell makes it special? If you eat out every single day, it starts to become boring. You don't even know where you want to eat because all that food, every single scrap of everything, you're a billionaire. It doesn't sound that good, does it? But a home-cooked meal by someone you love, maybe you fix it for them. Now that's special. It was crafted with love. When the food tastes good, it was hand-picked by you or someone else for you. One of the closing quotes of the documentary, which again, you got to see this thing, is that he said that his mother told him that when everything seems like it's going wrong, look for those people who are helping others because they're going to have exactly what you need. They're going to be the kind of people you want to hang out with in the first place, right? And I'm paraphrasing, but that is the brilliance of his mother. But he gave us a little litmus test that was beautifully played at the end of this documentary. And I don't mean to spoil this beautiful moment for you, but if you have a little bit more time to think about his litmus test, you might have a little bit more fun at the end of the episode. But he gave this beautiful monologue that was recorded, and it was played back to a lot of people that participated in the documentary, just being filmed, listening to his voice saying this. And I think everybody got pretty choked up. But he wanted you to think of someone in your life that was always supportive of you. That when you think of the one person that really gifted you with the perception of the world as it should be, who is that person? Some people said their mothers. Some people said Fred Rogers. Some people had other answers. And I thought, well, that's an interesting little question. I mean, it sounds like a little anecdotal test. Just remember someone nice in your life. But I think it goes way deeper than that. Because I'm sitting there thinking about the thing myself. I'm thinking, wow, who would that be? And it's instantaneous once you just contemplate the question. It's instantaneous. Whoever that person is, it comes right to your mind right away. For me, it would probably be my grandmothers. They were my moms. They grew up in an era where you were expected to have as much integrity as possible. They were extremely open-minded women. I didn't really have a bunch of controversy for them when I was a kid. But they were always there with a smile, a hug, encouragement. And none of it was frivolous. It wasn't like, oh, I just love everything that you do constantly. No, I had some requirements as a human being. I had to be a good person. Through and through, my soul had to be pure to get these women's love. But since they raised me, it was there. At least I hope it's there. Why is that important? Because Mr. Rogers is trying to say to you, I believe, once you find that person in your answer, you have the archetypal moment, that kernel spark of your existence that will predetermine how you are to be the very best person you can possibly be for the rest of your life. They may be dead and gone or in spiritual form, but you just need to think of them. When you have a question about how should I behave in this moment? What should I do? Should I raise my voice and get angry? Should I swallow it and get a different perspective until it can come out and it's not so acidic? Well, those two women would be the women that I would push everything through in my brain. I do it all the time. I do it all the time. And there's a lot more heroes than that, from my hometown, that I think about that kind of thing. My parents didn't have the benefit of, I think, growing up in their era, so they have as many flaws as I have when it comes to how to respond to things. So I have to leap another generation to get that purity. Now, were they perfect? Of course not. But I tell you what, if you had to itemize every time that they had hurt someone's feelings or taken more than they give, it's a dead record. There's nothing on it. There's no moment in their life where they ever did that, because that's what they were taught themselves, and that's how they valued themselves every day they laid down on a pillow at night to go to bed. We all know people like that. Some of you are like that. Naturally, you are a Mr. Rogers or a Mrs. Rogers, whatever it might be. And then you are more powerful than any of us to spread that love and that understanding to the world. The game that we're playing right now in the Great Awakening is that we need more people like that all over the world. The more that I study global conditions around the world, my fear is that we are waking up in the first world, and I am a little frightened that the other part of the world is unable to wake up because, and I hope I'm totally wrong. And I've given examples, like the gentleman I rode with from Vietnam. He said he grew up in the jungles of Vietnam, and he's actually going to quit his Uber job in San Francisco and get back to the jungles of Vietnam, because he said at least there we're real, we're loving. And that is where I see an example deep inside the jungle without television and all the material crap that we worship in this world. And they're able to be kind just because that's the way man is born to be. Man uninterrupted in a jungle, as long as there's not, genocidal wars going on, they have the opportunity to educate themselves, to have this beautiful simplicity to their life that is the way we were actually meant to be. There's this kind of rebirth of the notion of a job well done at the end of the day makes you feel better than anything in the entire world. You built something, you fed people, you helped people, you loved someone. It makes you feel wonderful at the end of the day. You sacrificed your time and your energy because someone else needed it more than you needed it for yourself. We must do those things. The problem that we have allowed to manifest in this world is that there was a group of people that dominated other people in war. They created suffering. They controlled things. And when they put their head down at night, it is that evil that they engage in that brings them an artificial, short-term styling of what perhaps we feel by simply helping another person. There's a lot of people in Christianity that they live every day. And I had a period of this in my own life, and you can still do this today, where the guy, regardless if you believe the guy ever existed or not, we have this saying, be more Christ-like. Because if you can't come up with any human in your life that is like your mother or your grandmother or your grandfather or what have you, your father, you can always lean back to this ever-forgiving, amazing person known as Jesus Christ, right? You can go there. Again, fictional or real, it doesn't matter. It would seem that I don't think it's much of a stretch. One of his sons actually said this, referenced his father like this, and I never felt like he was incorrect in this. But by the time I was done with the documentary, and I understand documentaries have angles and all this other kind of stuff, and no man is perfect. But I think that if we were to approach, again, if you see the documentary and you really study the interactions, some of it should make you want to weep. This guy was so good at what he did. I mean, geez, if the world was rolling like Mr. Rogers, I don't know if man would have any perception of limitation in his life or her life. That guy is as Christ-like as any person I've ever seen live in my lifetime. I know there's plenty that we have no names for. They're your relatives. Maybe it's even you. But if you want to reach out to you want to reach out to an example in the last 50 years of a dude who did it, he's one of the guys. Now, there was a bunch of funny conspiracies about the guy, all dismissed quite beautifully in the documentary by him being a Navy SEAL and all this other stuff. You don't want to go there. It's just a waste of your time. But the other thing that was interesting was because he was such a tender soul and so true to his form, they thought he was feminine. I mean, he had, I think, a fully enlightened brain, which means he had the Egyptian definition of enlightenment, which he had a fully functional left and right brain. He had the maternal instincts of a mother and the maternal instincts of a father, or paternal instincts of a father. He sang that song, every time he did a show, he sang a song. I don't know how many shows, it's 1,700 shows, I think it was, in the last shooting of his show, which means he sang that song 1,700 plus times, where he was inviting you to be his neighbor. It's an invitation, he said, to enjoy his world. And some people would look outside the box and go, oh my God, what delusion did this man have to believe that everything was so wonderful? Is it a fake Leave It to Beaver episode where the world's just this great place and there's a couple minor sins every episode that are then straightened out by the parents? What he did, in my opinion, was create the world around him, a halo that was his reality distortion field. This says, when you're in my circle, this is the way we roll. And you're going to be good to each other, and you're going to give, and you're going to give children 1,000% consideration. Whether it matters to you as an adult or not is irrelevant. When you, let's put it this way. When I was a budding parent, especially when my child was on the way, could talk to people a lot. I said, well, what would be your advice in being a parent? I got a whole episode on parenting, which has got a lot of wonderful comments and accolades from people, and I duly, humbly, I should say, accept those compliments. But the best piece of advice I ever got was, it's not about you anymore. It's about your kid. You are sacrificing your life to bring new life into this world. And it was the best piece of advice I ever got, because every single time I had to deal with, my daughter crying or something, whatever, the unpleasantries here and there of being a parent, which is actually pretty cool all the way through. In the end, once you understand, crying only has about 3 different meanings. Go see my show, Parenting, to get the definitions. That never stops when you're with a child. It doesn't matter if it's your kid or someone else's kid. Doesn't matter if they're totally ornery and little jerks, or if they're just totally big-eyed and looking you in the eye and going, what can we do? Let's have some fun. One of our listeners commented in YouTube recently, and I think it was a gentleman, was that he said that he had a 9-year-old son. And I believe he said he was in his mid-50s. He made it very, very big point to point that out. And he said, when I'm around my son, I am reborn as a beautiful person. because through the eyes of my child, I see the world all over again. And I had a partner of mine a year and a half ago who was 70 years old, and he had a 1-year-old daughter. And he was a hard dude, man. He was very, very wealthy. He had worked very, very hard his entire lifetime, and he had had his stomach kicked in several times by business deals and business people. And so he dealt with the world in a very tough arena, and he was good at it, let me tell you. But he would constantly come into our company and tell us the latest story about his daughter teaching him something. And he was smitten, boy. He built his whole life around his kid. In fact, one of the reasons why he was a little hesitant to invest in any company at all, because he said, I have to be able to invest and walk away, and I have to be able to trust everything's going to go well if I do so. And so, because he wanted to go back to his kid, he goes, I really just want to grow up with my daughter. I don't have many years left on this planet, and she deserves to have my guidance for as long as possible. The cool thing was he also kept himself very healthy. He went back. He was always pretty healthy. He believed in working out and staying healthy and all that kind of stuff, but he was being extra careful so he could be with his kid as long as possible. But now here's my angle at the end of this whole thing. What if we're all kids? What if every single one of us are just as vulnerable as we were when we were little kids? All the little things and tics and worries that we had about who we were especially are still right there on the absolute surface. And even if someone can put on a stoic shell that says, I don't care what you think about me, maybe we all do care to some degree. Now, on the internet, you definitely got to grow some thick skin. I tell you, if you make one of these shows, you got to just understand that people are in their little perspectives. If a kid came into your daycare center and you've never had them before and they're just a little ornery kid, it's going to take time, if you're lucky, to change their mind about being that way. It's going to take some time to get the kid to see how all the other kids are cool. Okay, maybe that's still all of us. The reason why I mention that is because the methods that Mr. Rogers used with children to engage them and address their concerns and their fears, maybe it's exactly the same as how we should treat each other. I think that's how he went off and talked to adults. Now, he seemingly, when he talked to the adults, was coming at them at such a primitive core value system that the adults were like, are you for real? Are you really asking me these questions? You're talking to me kind of like I'm a little kid, and maybe their ego stepped in and, there's some passive, aggressive feelings that they were being patronized or something. I think we all know he wasn't doing that. When I was a kid, they used to tell me, it was said all around me constantly, that as you get older, you get very cynical. Or at least that you can. And that's before the world was as dark as it is today, right? I mean, things were pretty good when I was a kid, and they were still saying people get really cynical and dark. And they said it in several ways, that it was almost an imperative that this was going to happen to me, that I was going to grow really cynical. And I had at least one family member that was not aware that this was going to occur, and that person fell into it hardcore. And they were in my circle, so I ended up adopting some of that behavior, which has taken me decades and decades to get rid of. And it will probably be the bane of my existence. As Paul had the undefined thorn in his side, that would be my thorn in my side, is to remain as genuine and as honest and as giving and as real as I possibly can to counteract any of that cynicism. But there are things that we grow cynical about, right? We want to wake up and not believe that the world cannot be made a good place, right? It's a double negative, but we want to believe that we can make the world a good place, and we don't want to believe that it's impossible to make the world a good place, that the evil will dominate. As I used to say on the show a lot, we got some homework, folks. We got some major, major homework, and It's not something we're probably going to solve in a comment section on a YouTube channel or on a Facebook post. Maybe a little bit in Facebook. I don't know. It's going to come with us re-engineering who we are by figuring out who we are. And then behaving properly to each other and having that little bit of understanding for folks that are having a really bad day, which might translate to a rough stretch in life. Are people going to try to take advantage of us? Oh, yeah, most definitely. If someone's doing that, they're in such a state of pain and disarray that they probably are not conscious that they're doing it. Or if they are conscious, they simply don't know any other method to survive but to take. They're in sort of a level 1 state of intellectual feralness. For those of us having a slightly better life, or even struggling with the same things, but we have methods of dealing with it that don't end in a cynical heart, a hardened coal for a heart. I think that most of us know that we manufacture happiness, we manufacture goodness. It's a product that we create. There's no limit to it. There is a rate at which we can create it, so we have to be careful not to drain ourselves down. As I've said in other episodes, yes, a person who is depressed, a person who is sort of in that downer state, everything they say is really just kind of a Debbie Downer sort of phrase. There may be moments in your life where you simply have been exhausted, and there's nothing you can do to bring them up. They need to go off on their own, find their path, maybe self-destruct, rebuild, and you meet them later. And they're like, yeah, sorry, I was such a jerk back in those days. Oh, that was my dark days. I've got plenty of my friends. I just hung out with one of them this evening, and he's a beautiful guy. He said he was in a bad state. He was in a bad state. You know, in America, when you grow older, it's tougher and tougher to get jobs, even though you're 100% qualified for them. In fact, you're maybe 1,000% qualified for them. And you don't need a whole lot of money because you're not hooked on a bunch of consumerism. You don't have a big mortgage or big car payment. You're just living a simplified life. And so the company could actually save money and get far more expertise and patience and dedication from a person that's a little bit older. But in their mind, they're like, I'd like to have a little young kid running around the office with a bunch of great idealistic ideas, willing to take a fraction of the check that you have, even though I'm going to have to babysit them and spend money. My company's going to slow down. And maybe they won't decide to work out in the end. It's interesting. But he had gone through a dark phase in his life. And he just came to the conclusion, well, I'm just going to have to take the jobs I can get. And he did. And he's okay now. Is he in the most perfect state? Nah. Did he really compromise his standards to live? Not really. In fact, he learned that he wasn't compromising his standards by taking those other jobs. And now he goes to bed every night with the knowledge of a job well done. Funny how that happens, huh? So my advice is to go see the Mr. Rogers documentary. Even if you had to pay $4 for it, do it. It's good for you. It's good for your soul. And I would say, depending on how much you feel like you absorb it in one watch, maybe watch it again. I will most likely watch it a couple more times. What's amazing to me is that I watched that show as a kid, and I didn't have any ill feelings towards that man whatsoever. There have been definitely times in my life where I was like, is that guy for real? And that was one of the questions they addressed in the documentary. And everybody who knew him, including his wife and his best friends, were like, yes. And that's what made him phenomenal. He was exactly the way he was on that show in real life. He wasn't playing some character. Wow. Unbelievable. And in this documentary, they film him hanging out in his house, doing all kinds of experimental footage where he's kind of working out the themes of his show. He was a very deep thinker. He really understood deep human philosophy. But he knew that no one could understand that, least of all children. And so he brought the themes forward in a way that they could understand. And again, godlike in every way, he just found simple practices with kids. That's what we need to do with each other. And that's what I hope you get when you watch the Mr. Rogers documentary. Well done. If anybody from that show ever just happens on this video and you're entranced because your work is being talked about, brilliant job. Brilliant job. Everyone who worked on the show, thank you very much for making that show possible. And if this is your first time seeing my show, definitely beware. The rest of the show is similar in theme, but not quite in the PG rating that we're going to give this one, or a G rating. And if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. It's where you can change feeds from audio to video. There's a locked Facebook group with some of the coolest people on the planet. There's a Twitter account in case you guys want to get your feed through Twitter. Just get notifications that the videos exist. I would always just say subscribe to the YouTube and click that bell so you can get nice little notifications as soon as it drops. I think most of you guys do that because, boy, I will drop a video and in 10 minutes it's watched 20 times. So that's super incredible to see that the content is being absorbed that quickly. I appreciate it. I appreciate every single one of you. For those of you who want to contribute to the show's upkeep and the cigars I got to buy and all the other good stuff, pay me for a little bit of my time. There's a Patreon account in case you want to do that. For all my Patreons, super appreciate it. What ends up happening on Patreon is that you get early previews. So as soon as the video it starts uploading from my computer, I cut and paste the URL while it's uploading into Patreon. You got to wait a couple hours for it to upload and then encode. But you can get it as soon as the, the 144p encodes. All the shows are in Season 4 have been uploaded in 4K. Some of the shows, for whatever reason, there's some bug in YouTube where it doesn't encode it in 4K, unfortunately. I'm keeping all the originals backed up in many different manners. So at some point when we get to a better platform, everything will go up, hopefully sparkling clean. But anyway, take care of yourself and someone else like Mr. Rogers would do, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.